Good afternoon, everyone. We are very pleased to welcome you for this live OECD Green Talk on the topic of moving the world economy to net zero and the role of transition finance and planning. My name is Mathilde Mesnard. I'm a Deputy Director at the OECD Environment Directorate and Coordinator for Climate and Green Finance. And I will be moderating this event today. So first, let me give you a quick rundown of the agenda and some housekeeping rules. To kick us off, we'll have opening remarks by our director, Jyotinder, followed by a presentation of the OECD team on our guidance on transition finance. After the presentation, we'll have two interventions from representatives of the Sustainable Finance Institute of Asia and the IMF. After these interventions, we'll open the floor for a Q&A session where you can ask questions to all the speakers. And if you would like to ask a question, please use the Zoom Q&A function at any time during the talk. And we'll try to address as many questions as possible, given the time that we have. So now I will give the floor to Jyotinder, our director, for some opening remarks. Jo, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mathilde, and good afternoon, good evening, good morning, colleagues who are joining in on this seminar. I'm delighted to open this OECD Green Talk Live on moving the world economy to net zero and the role of transition finance and transition planning. We know that to transition the global economy to a 1.5 degree world, more investments in zero emission solutions are really urgently needed, while at the same time, investments in high emission assets and infrastructures have to be phased out. Green and sustainable finance have grown significantly in the last few years and have really helped to shift the focus of financial institutions and investors towards investment into clean technologies like renewable energy. But high carbon, energy intensive and hard to abate sectors continue to play a really key role in the economy, and it's going to take quite a bit of time to change that. So to meet the goal, the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement, companies in these sectors need to have a plan to bring their emissions into net zero trajectories, and those plans have to start immediately. In response to the perceived limitations of sustainable finance and its narrow focus on what is already green today, the concept of transition finance has rapidly gained traction in the last couple of years. Now, that's led to a proliferation of diverse transition finance initiatives, both by governments and by industry. Transition finance provides a promising avenue to be inclusive of all sectors, while also bringing companies in emerging markets and developing economies into the conversation. Transition finance is a concept that doesn't yet have a universally agreed definition. This, I'm sure, is going to come across in our discussion today. The lack of a common definition and the lack of universally applied criteria are key challenges. It means that questions linger about the environmental and market integrity of transition finance approaches and potential risks of so-called greenwashing. Now, to reduce this risk and give credibility to transactions, the OECD guidance on transition finance recommends anchoring them in credible company-wide transition plans. The guidance sets out 10 key elements which can form the basis for credible corporate climate transition plans and for transactions. I'm going to leave it to my colleagues to do a deep dive into the main elements of that OECD guidance on transition finance, but let me stress how important it is to continue monitoring the transition finance market and to develop robust policies and frameworks to strengthen environmental integrity. It's good to start with the so-called low-hanging fruit, but we can't leave the hard-to-abate sectors and industries for later. We need to plan it right, and start down the pathway to a genuine net zero. And the OECD stands ready to support members' efforts to advance these discussions. I'm really looking forward to hearing your views on the next priorities and policy measures to ensure that climate transition finance can reach the regions and companies that need it the most. And I wish you all a fruitful discussion. Thanks, Mathilde, back to you.
Thank you, Jo, for setting the scene. And now I would like to give the floor to Elia Trippel and Valentina Bellesi from the OECD Green Finance and Investment team, and they will continue the presentation of the OECD guidance on transition finance. So please, Elia and Valentina, you have the floor now.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. I think we have some slides that we'd like to show as well to support our presentation. I'll just wait for my colleague to get those up. Thank you very much. We can go straight into the next slide. Thank you. So Jo already gave a really good overview of the key issues that we're grappling with and where the OECD guidance on transition finance comes in. I will just pick up on some of those points to give a bit more context. So the OECD guidance was developed last year within the context of new IPCC conclusions that very clearly stated that emissions had to peak before 2025 in order for us to be able to get to net zero by 2050. And this peak in 2025 needs to be followed by very rapid emission reductions across the entire economy. And as Jo has said, that means especially targeting energy-intensive and hard-to-abate sectors, and of course, companies in emerging markets and developing economies. And so you can see on this pie chart here a bit of an overview of where GHG emissions are distributed in the economy. And if you look at the distribution for industry and energy, you can see that that makes up more than 50%. But actually, if you look at which sectors use that final energy, you can get to almost 90% just for industry and for buildings. And those tend to be, in particular, industry tends to be an area where traditional sustainable finance approaches are not always enough because they might be too narrow and looking at too few technologies. Next slide, please. I think you can click again. That should just, yeah, thank you. And so the OECD guidance, what it does, as Jo has already mentioned, it tries to provide an approach that can apply across the economy and that can apply to these hard-to-abate sectors because it is much more inclusive than sustainable finance. But of course, it runs the risk of greenwashing by being so inclusive. And so the guidance provides a comparison of existing transition finance approaches, of which there are actually quite a few now. It sets out some of the key challenges in this space, in particular based on an industry survey that we carried out when we developed the guidance. And importantly, it sets out 10 elements of credible transition plans that can support the environmental and market integrity of transition finance transactions. And the way that it is developed, we consider it to be relevant for a wide variety of stakeholders. So we think it can help financial market participants identify credible investments. It can help corporates develop transition strategies. And of course, it can help policymakers who would like to legislate in this area identify what elements are necessary to include in credible policies on transition planning. Let's move to the next slide, please. And so given that there are so many different approaches out there, as Jo has said, there is indeed no consensus definition, but there are some elements I think that many actors can agree on, and those we set out in the guidance as well. So transition finance tends to be most relevant for sectors and activities where there isn't really a viable green substitute yet, but where those sectors are definitely on a way towards reaching net zero, and where there is a credible future trajectory to get to net zero, even if the technologies aren't zero emission today. And so the working definition that we use for transition finance as part of the guidance is that it's finance which is deployed by corporates to implement their net zero transition. And that transition has to be in line with the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. And so there you can really see the two key distinctions between what we would normally call green or sustainable finance and transition finance, where transition finance really focuses on this dynamic process of becoming sustainable and moving towards net zero, whereas green and transition finance sometimes is more limited to a sort of point-in-time assessment of what is already green. Next slide, please.
So here I would like to present you a stock take of transition-related financial instruments that we have developed in the guidance. And we have found that transition finance to date has been mainly been extended through fixed income instruments, namely sustainability-linked bonds, so SLBs, and sustainability-linked loans, SLLs, as well as to a much lower extent, transition bonds. And here on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the current composition of the sustainable debt market as of last year. And you can see that, well, it's still very much dominated by green bonds, but sustainability-linked loans and bonds in particular are really representing a growing share of the market and are also growing quite fast. They're a relatively new asset class. They represented about 33% of the total debt market last year, which amounts to about slightly more than $500 billion. And we have considered it to be very relevant to transition finance because most of these sustainability-linked instruments actually have targets that are related to emission reductions. A lot of them have been also verified by initiatives such as science-based target initiatives. And the promising feature of this instrument, let's say, is that it's allowing a lot of companies, especially in hard-to-abate sectors, such as industry, so steel, cement, for instance, to issue, to raise capital through sustainable finance instruments that weren't accessible before. However, these instruments are generally for general purpose. So a company can really raise capital for whatever purpose it needs to, and it links the financing that it receives either through a loan or a bond to a specific predefined target that needs to be achieved at some point in the future. So it's still quite early to be able to assess the real potential of this market segment, but there have been already some concerns both by financial market participants, but also by regulators, especially at European level, and civil society about potential greenwashing risks of these instruments for two main reasons. One, that oftentimes these instruments actually don't disclose details about the targets. And second, they often use composite ESG score, so environmental social governance score, to link the financing with. And we know that there's still quite a lack of comparability, of accuracy, and transparency around ESG metrics. So this is a bit problematic. And if we can go to the next slide, please. So here, I would like to tell you a bit more about why we have focused the guidance so much on transition plans. First of all, I'll just give you a definition of what we consider to be a transition plan, which is a time-bound, cross-cutting action plan that a company would develop, setting out in detail how it intends to achieve its transition strategy and targets to really transform the business model. So including its operations, its assets, its relationships towards, both suppliers and customers, to make it align to net zero pathway in line with the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. And why we have focused on corporate transition plans? Well, first, because we have seen these serious greenwashing issues in the transition finance space, which really risk undermining the credibility of the market, corporate transition plans should really be about, as I said, a systemic transformation of the business model. So the providers of transition finance really need to be in a position to assess both the economic and environmental credibility of a company's plan to transition. Yet we've also seen that despite increasing calls by investors for companies to disclose these plans, there's really a minority of companies who are disclosing, developing and disclosing transition plans. So on the right-hand side, you see this donut chart showing that of the total companies that disclose to CDP, who has one of the largest database of companies' climate disclosures, only a third have a transition plan in place. And even amongst those that do have it, the existing disclosure is quite limited and inadequate. And there was just a report published, I think the day before yesterday, by CDP, saying that not even 1% of the companies that disclose to them have credible plans. So if we go to the next slide, please. Here, I would like to show you the landscape of transition plans internationally. We've seen that there's really been a mushrooming of initiatives with different purposes, different roles, and different stakeholder groups, going from disclosure frameworks, which have been developed by both national and international standard setters, authorities, regulatory authorities, etc., which are setting standards for climate disclosures, which also typically includes elements to be included as part of companies' transition plans. We also have a second category of initiatives that are providing services to help companies develop those plans or validating them, especially the targets associated with those plans. We also have a wide range of both industry and civil society and market actors developing pathways and methodologies to be used to guide the development of transition plans, and as well as data collection and analysis providers. And one thing I would also like to highlight, which is not included in this slide, let's say a fifth category is also the range of international initiatives that have been focusing on transition finance and transition plans lately, namely at the G20 level last year under the Indonesian presidency. The Sustainable Finance Working Group has very much focused on transition finance, and also through the IPSF, the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, there's been quite a strong focus on that, and we have been contributing to these efforts over the past year through the guidance. So I'll stop here and pass it back to Elia.
Thank you very much, Valentina. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So these last two slides, I will go through them at a rather high level, because we could, I think, spend hours talking about the details of the different elements that we consider to be necessary to develop a credible corporate transition plan. But just to say a couple of things up front, so when we developed our 10 elements of credible corporate transition plans, luckily it was 10, is a nice round number. We looked at all of these existing approaches, and we did try and see where the commonalities are, so that we're not adding to the landscape, but trying to find a way to bring together also existing approaches that may focus on certain portions, but not cover the entire range of elements that we think are important. So when you look at the report, there is a very detailed overview, especially in the annex, a big overview table that shows exactly what other approaches are putting forward and how they align with our guidance and where the overlaps are. And so, as I mentioned, we have 10 elements. They fall broadly into 3 categories. This first category that you can see on this slide is basically all of the elements that you would need in order to have a credible net zero strategy in your plan. There are other things that are important, and they're on the next slide. So I'll talk about that in a second. But these are kind of the main elements on the net zero side. So that means setting, of course, a net zero target, which may be 2050. It might be before. It may also be after, depending on the sector and on the geography. Using certain tools in order to give credibility to investors and to show that you can achieve the target that you have set yourself. So that can be sectoral pathways, it can be taxonomies, it can be roadmaps, it can be many different things. Of course, setting KPIs and doing the appropriate emissions reporting, being very clear on how carbon credits and offsets are used. So we recommend that the use is extremely limited and very carefully explained. And of course, identifying any kind of risks with regard to emission-intensive lock-in, because that is the biggest risk that we see in transition finance. So companies need to carry out a risk assessment to identify what assets they have that may be at risk and explain what mechanisms they're putting in place to safeguard against those risks. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so here you see a few other elements that we consider to be important that give additional credibility, but are not limited to the net zero portion of the plan. So the first two relate to other environmental objectives, which ideally would be taken into account in the plan. Again, it depends on the capacity of the company, but some companies are able to do that, and they should. Of course, ideally, a plan would also have just transition considerations. And then the last 3 elements that you can see here are more about internal governance, internal coherence with financial planning, and any type of additional verification and reporting that can be done. So those are more governance arrangements to give additional credibility to the plan and essentially show to investors and to stakeholders that it's not just a document that the company publishes, but that it's a strategy that they can actually follow through with. I think I will stop here. So if you're interested in finding out more about the 10 elements, of course, feel free to read the report. We also have a policy highlights document that provides a little bit more detail on the 10 elements, which you can also access on the same site as the report. And I'll hand over to Mathilde at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Elia and Valentina. So now that we have presented to you the guidance of the OECD on transition finance, I would like to call Eugene Wang, the CEO of the Sustainable Finance Institute of Asia. Could you tell us more about the main ongoing initiatives happening at the ASEAN level on transition finance, and how you will see this guidance helping Asian countries mobilize financing for the transition? Please, Eugene, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mathilde, and thank you very much for inviting me to join the session. Let me first start by taking a step back and share with you what constitutes the pillars of ASEAN sustainable finance ecosystem. We have 3 pillars. The first is actually taxonomy, the second is transitions, and the third is disclosures. And these 3 pillars work together for our system. Now, it's critical for us to pay attention to transition because we know it's not possible to turn green overnight. And if we don't create practical pathways, what we will have is a situation where we're losing a lot of time talking about very idealistic scenarios while the clock is ticking. Now, I want to qualify here that transitions, taxonomies, and disclosures are but part of the solution. There are many other elements that we have to look at, but we cannot ignore these 3 pillars because they're essential in helping that journey for all of us. It's easy to talk about transition, but it's really hard to execute because it is a balance between ambition and reality. And at a more granular level, ambitions and realities differ for everyone. And this is why we don't have a universal understanding or agreement until today. Now, in Southeast Asia, the central banks and capital market regulators have established positions on transition and encapsulated these positions in their sustainable finance guiding documents. Now we have 3 documents on this, 1 from the central banks and 2 from the capital market policymakers and regulators. Let me share with you a bit what the central banks say. So the central banks have said that we need to take into account the social and economic structures and the different levels of development in our member states. And as such, we have to adopt a gradual or phased approach in promoting and facilitating a transition. We also must exercise flexibility when adopting international best practices. Again, this is because of the differences in the ambition and the realities. And interestingly, the central bank said this back in 2020. The capital market regulators said 2 things. The first is that the level and nature of economic and industrial development among our member states is diverse, and therefore we need to have tiered approaches so that all our member states are able to have an approach that they are able to adopt so that they can transition to sustainable economy. Now that's the point about inclusiveness. They also recognize a loud call for support to be given to those who are trying or need to gradually move to that perfect point but can't get there today, because in their mind, some progress is better than no progress. So in short, this is why the 3 pillars are so important for us, and we need to have these 3 pillars work holistically to drive our transition. Let me talk about the first pillar, which is the taxonomy. We are developing a regional taxonomy in Southeast Asia that is inclusive to all our member states, given their diversity, and at the same time will support an orderly and effective transition. This entails a taxonomy design that is multi-tiered at 2 levels, and I did mention multi-tiered just now. The first is that it has a principles-based framework as well as a technical quantitative screening criteria. Now, the principles-based framework takes into consideration remedial measures to transition, and this is done on purpose because we want to encourage people to start transitioning. We want to allow them to take the steps that they can take, provided they're disciplined and hold to a very clear pathway. The technical screening criteria that we have is slightly different from what the EU has. I mean, in terms of taxonomy design, we're generally very similar to the EU's, but our technical screening criteria actually has more than 1 threshold. The EU has 1. And our thresholds, which can go up to 3 per economic activity, can be used to construct a pathway to net zero. This is very similar to placing stepping stones to cross a river. Sometimes the river is much wider at certain points and you need more stepping stones because you need more opportunities to jump across the river. And for us, this is a very important part of the taxonomy because it encourages all our member states to be able to create a transition pathway for themselves. Now, the use of a taxonomy is actually very much in line with element 2, as was shared just now, of the OECD guidance, which is using sectoral pathways, technology roadmaps, and taxonomies, because while we may have a lot of difficulty constructing regional sectoral pathways, it's maybe easier to use technology roadmaps and taxonomies to help guide decision-making. And our ASEAN taxonomy also seeks to ensure that the achievement of one environmental objective doesn't compromise other environmental objectives by considering do no significant harm. And again, this was something that's addressed in the 10 elements of the EU guidance. Importantly for us, we think that this sort of taxonomy approach will help us orient capital towards sustainable investments, but also help users of capital understand what's eligible as green, as well as provide markers for users to develop a transition pathway. In fact, the companies can use this. Of course, we'd like to work towards a common approach for transition for the region because while we're all very diverse and have different situations and resources, we do want to more effectively and efficiently orient capital as a region. So our discussions on transition actually highlight 2 things that we have to address. The first is we want to avoid lock-ins, and that was in element 5 just now that was discussed. And the other thing is we want to avoid the backloading as well. We don't want transition pathways or frameworks to allow people to backload and in the end kick the can down the road and never achieve anything. So again, for us, a transition guidance will help capital users develop their transition pathways. And in this regard, instruments are really, really important. That was highlighted in the presentation before mine, that instruments are necessary to support transition finance. So the ASEAN capital market regulators at the end of last year jointly issued standards for sustainability-linked bonds because, again, this will help mitigate greenwashing and provide clear guidance. We have a regional ambition in ASEAN, and our member states are in very different situations. Our highest GDP per capita per annum is 60,000 US dollars, and the lowest is 1,200. So for us, transitions have not only to be just, but they have to be also affordable, because we want to avoid social and economic dislocations. We have to consider things like jobs, government revenues, business competitiveness. And I can say that COVID-19 has certainly set us back. It's damaged a lot of supply chains and scarred them. So we are fighting two battles at one go. One is on the climate agenda, the other is on the social agenda. And to me, if we lose either battle, we actually lose the entire war. So in this regard, our taxonomy is actually a sustainable finance taxonomy to address these areas. And again, interestingly, this ties into element 7 that was raised just now of the OECD guidance, which is supporting a just transition. Lastly, we want to ensure that disclosures are there, because we actually need transparency. Without information, people can't make the right decisions. And for us, transparency also helps mitigate the problems that are of great concern, like backloading and lock-ins, because they will actually be able to help provide that market discipline to all participants. I'll just stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eugene, and thank you for linking it to our guidance. It's very useful, and thanks for your focus on how to make sure that these, as you say, the analogy you made, that we need different and maybe numerous stepping stones to cross the river when it's bigger. So I think it's a very nice way to putting it. So now I would like to give the floor to Charlotte Gards-Londolfini, who is a climate change, energy, and financial stability expert at the IMF. So Charlotte, you have joined us. Yes, I see you. So could you please share with us your views on what are the main tools that policymakers have at their disposal to scale up transition finance, and how the IMF is integrating transition considerations in its capacity development work on sustainable and transition finance? Please, Charlotte, you have the...
Thank you. I hope you can hear me well, and thank you very much for the insightful discussions here. I think what I'm about to say is actually very close to what Eugene was saying. We're very much involved in transition finance work, policy work, and also bilateral technical assistance and capacity development. So I would say first that I think, given the fact we need to adopt that whole of economy climate transition, policy action is actually needed to send the correct, I would say, market signals, and to incentivize and accelerate the mobilization of private capital flows in order to ensure that we do finance, as it has been said before, the orderly transition of those high emitting and hard to abate sectors, and to mitigate the risks of creating stranded assets. We're far from there now, I think we have to say it, especially because we've seen for a year and a half now, even before the war in Ukraine, that the energy policy context and the fact that we're not substituting right now renewable energy, we're not substituting, fossil fuel investment by renewable energy investment enough, shows that we still have a long way to go. And this is something we look at the IMF very closely, obviously, in our surveillance work, climate stress testing that we do perform for lots of countries, and also in our policy work, obviously. So I would just have to say first that this is obviously difficult, but also that we've gone a bit backwards the past year, and that carbon lock-in is actually a thing. We've never burned as much coal as we have in the history of humanity as last year. So I think it's really important that we do acknowledge also the investment trends in the sector. I'm talking primarily about power production, but that's also the case in other hard-to-abate sectors. So this is why the role of policymakers is obviously really important. I would say there are many tools for that. Of course, there is the use of public financing. We are working a lot on the whole de-risking agenda. Also, the IMF has launched recently a new lending facility called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust that is providing a 20-year-ish maturity loan to countries It's available to about 2/3 of the IMF membership, and it's got a 12-year-and-a-half grace period, and it's supported by critical policy reforms, of macro critical importance, I should say, related to climate change and building resilience to climate change. This is all the more related also to the whole de-risking blended finance agenda, obviously putting the multilateral development banks around the table and the public sector in order to see how the policy reforms embedded in there, but also the financing structures that we do elaborate actually support and incentivize the transitional activities by improving also the availability and the affordability of financing for the climate transition. So I would say there are these tools first, but second, and perhaps to be more in line with the OECD guidance and also what's been said during this workshop, I would say that it's a combination of pricing and non-pricing policy tools. We all know about carbon pricing and all the challenges related to that. In the IMF, for instance, we've drawn lots of policy recommendations on an international carbon price floor, but also something that is very important to scale up transition finance and very much in line again with what's been said before, is that information and data is key. And for that, we need to identify the transitional assets and investment. If I want to be a bit blunt, I would say that it's actually in the IPCC report. If you look at the executive summary, they have this great chart of the 5 sectors of our economy, the 5 most important sectors in terms of current greenhouse gas emissions. And that tells you what is the potential contribution to net emission reduction, but also what is the net lifetime cost of those options across the energy sector, the building sector, the transportation sector, the industry sector, and the agriculture and forest and land use sector. So based on that, we need what we call a climate information architecture. So that's the link I think Eugene made very well between taxonomies and sectoral pathways, the fact that you need those sectoral pathways with targets and timeframes that can be converted in transition taxonomies, that sort of traffic light approach. How do you go from the red to the green? And then transition plans at the company level. And this is very much related to what's in the OECD guidance. Those need to be science-based, they need to be verifiable, and they need to be supported by disclosures. When it comes to the corporates, we talk a lot about them for obvious reasons, but also on the sovereign side and other asset classes, which tend to be completely overlooked in the current policy framework in our view. So this is very much important that we do have like alignment with those pathways and taxonomies, that the greenhouse gas data encompasses all 3 scopes, obviously, and then that we have the transition plans from the corporates with the, let's say, related governance arrangements that need to be incorporated there as well. Another element I want to raise, actually, which is very much important for anyone who does data-related work and digs into the data every day, I think it's on the adaptation of statistical classifications as well. The fact that currently the statistical classifications, they are not sufficiently granular enough to capture the nuances within activities. For instance, when you look at ISIC, it's adopting the perspective of productive activities. So there is a very secondary role played in the classification as it stands for actual production processes and technology. So it means that when you look at the power production sector, for instance, you just have one code, but it does not allow you to go deeper into how power has actually been produced, and then to distinguish across fossil fuel-based production, for instance, from renewable-based production. And that's actually something very, let's say, difficult and challenging when it comes then to build on these for transition planning, but also for transition-related financial instruments. And so it gets me to go to the second point on the transition, the fact that we have to set standards for transition finance instruments. And there we've done a lot of work, and you know, there's been a lot of academic work also in this area. The fact that when you look at, for instance, the sustainability-linked bonds so far, the greenhouse, I mean, they all encompass, for most of them at least, greenhouse gas and environmental targets. But when you see that the penalties are not high enough, so that would create that, you know, incentive to actually reach the target. So apart from the operational advantages for emerging market issuers especially, we think that these outcome-based instruments are very much important, that further standards need to be set out because they can signal to investors that the issuing firm, on the basis of that transition plan, which has been elaborated on the basis of these sectoral pathways, transition taxonomies, to see that the issuing firm is actually committed, for instance, to improving its emissions over time. So the financial incentive to reach the target, if it's sufficiently high, it can be a strong incentive to actually for the issuer and also to alleviate, I would say, the concerns of the investors about greenwashing, for instance. So these SLBs or SLLs, because we talk a lot about bond issuance, but loan issuance primarily important, are also very suitable for investors that are looking to ensure the sustainability impact, obviously, of their investment. So, but the thing is that we need to solve as policymakers the practical challenges that are related to these sustainability-linked bonds and loans. And I think the fact that the penalty comes now, for instance, in the form of a step-up for the issuers that they must pay on the bonds coupon payment if the target is not reached, well, that penalty should be probably higher, and there should be like a law and economics approach to that in order to make sure that there are the right incentives to actually reach those targets. But these are actually very important to be linked with what we call that climate information architecture then, because you need, the right data, the right information, the right sectoral pathway to actually be able to like bet on this target and to actually reach it. So I would say,
sorry, could you conclude, please, so that we have enough time?
No, of course, sorry, I tend to be very talkative all the time. But just to say that then at the IMF, as part of our policy work that is closely related to IMF programs, but also outside of programs related to technical assistance and capacity development and to the conditionalities that are embedded into the IMF programs, we are very much working on this, obviously, and helping out countries and all the more so in the future to actually set up those transition finance frameworks. But again, in very close relation with the sectoral pathways and the sectoral roadmaps that are adopted at national and regional level. So I hope that answered the initial question. And
yes, thank you very much. You covered a lot of ground and mentioned a lot of very important points regarding monitoring and incentives to make sure that first there is disclosure, and then there is a way to figure out whether companies do achieve their targets. So that's a couple of other elements. Your comment on the need for adapting the statistical classification is also very important. So thanks also for linking the company level with the more like framework level and what countries should do to ensure that they have the proper framework. So we have a lot of issues on the table, a lot of challenges. I would like now to open the Q&A session. We have a couple of good questions from the audience. Let me begin by a question that comes often when we discuss transition finance, but it's a very fundamental one. So I will ask and maybe target it to Elia. Can gas and nuclear energy be incorporated in a transition plan according to the OECD guidance? And how has gas and nuclear energy been treated in the OECD guidance? For example, do differences exist to the EU taxonomy? That's a hot issue in Europe. So please, Elia, could you help us delve into this question?
Thank you, Mathieu. This is my favorite topic. So love the question. So maybe to just take a quick step back, I think Eugene touched upon this in his intervention too. Transition plans and taxonomies are not the same thing, and they work differently. And so a taxonomy can be a very, very helpful tool as part of a transition plan, but a transition plan is much, much bigger than that, because it's really about the entire entity-wide strategy to get to net zero, and a taxonomy will set out specific technologies and activities that can help you do that. Like, for example, certain types of energy sources or certain types of other types of assets that you may want to invest in, depending on what sector you're in. But a taxonomy does not make a transition plan, because in a transition plan, you would also want to have transparency on things like offsets, scope 3 emissions, additional steps and tools that you use in order to get to your net zero target. So technology roadmaps and pathways were mentioned, alignment with net zero scenarios, and so on. Whereas a taxonomy will only give you guidance on what kind of investments you need to carry out as part of your plan. And so to cut a long story short, the guidance, the OECD guidance doesn't specify what kind of technologies would make it in or out, because that's not the purpose of a guidance on transition planning. That's the purpose of a taxonomy. And of course, taxonomies will be different in different regions. And so this guidance would not be the right place to make any judgment on that. What the guidance does do is explain that taxonomies should be used where possible, where they exist, in order to help guide the transition plan and the transition planning of the company. What the guidance also says, which was, I think, point 5 among the 10 elements, is that companies need to be very clear on any types of risks that they have with regards to emission-intensive lock-in. And so any assets or infrastructures related to natural gas would fall under that. So a company that has those assets or is planning to invest into those assets would have to be extremely clear on what type of safeguards it's putting in place to make sure that that infrastructure or that asset is future-proof and consistent with a net zero pathway. And so in the guidance, we set out a few of the existing mechanisms. We consider that the mechanisms that exist today are insufficient to really provide for environmental integrity. So we're doing some follow-up work at the moment with Valentina on mechanisms to prevent emission-intensive lock-in in transition and sustainable finance. So that will be published later this year, because we think that what's out there at the moment is obviously going in the right direction, but we think that additional safeguards can be put in place. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Elia. It's quite clear. And now I have a question for Eugene about the ASEAN taxonomy. So first, what is the status of the taxonomy? And related question, as there are multiple evolving guidance on transition finance, and as emerging economies do not have interoperable taxonomies, how do you ensure that we are all on the same page? That's for
Those are really great questions.
Yeah.
And actually the reason why the ASEAN taxonomy came into being. Let me answer the first question first. What is the status of the ASEAN taxonomy? So the version 1 of the ASEAN taxonomy was published in November the 10th, 2021. And it was actually intended to be a consultation document. So we were probably at version 1.5, but we published version 1, which contained all the key elements of the taxonomy. It's really the taxonomy design, and we consulted on that. We've consulted very heavily with all our stakeholders. We've received feedback, and we're incorporating that into version 2, which will be released in the very early part of this year. And I say early part, I mean probably around the first quarter, end of the first quarter. And that version 2 will contain a fleshed out taxonomy design together with a technical screening criteria for one pilot sector. This question about national taxonomies is a very interesting one, because as you know, there's a proliferation of taxonomies at the moment. We have about 30 official taxonomies, another 150 to 180 proprietary belonging to the FIs and the likes. So taxonomies were actually created to reduce fragmentation, but now we're experiencing this spate of fragmentation through many taxonomies. What we are doing at the ASEAN level, and ASEAN consists of 10 member states, is that we're allowing and even encouraging our member states to come up with national taxonomies. But because national taxonomies address national agendas, right? We have very differing situations, we have very differing needs, so the national taxonomies address that. But what we want is for our ASEAN taxonomies to be interoperable with each other. And the ASEAN taxonomy serves as that universal converter, if you like. At the same time, this is the converter for the ASEAN region together with the rest of the world. This is why taxonomy design that's interoperable and compatible with major taxonomies is very important for us. So what is the status of our national taxonomies vis-a-vis the regional taxonomy today? I can say that we have a few clusters. The first is actually countries who are using or going or about to use a principles-based taxonomy. That's Malaysia, and who's come up with the taxonomy. Philippines, which has announced the development of taxonomy. Those will be compatible with the foundation framework of the ASEAN taxonomy, and at a later stage, they will then be able to adopt the technical screening criteria of the ASEAN taxonomy. We have Singapore and Thailand who have come out and consulted on their taxonomies. Those taxonomies use a traffic light system, and the technical screening criteria, which is compatible with the regional taxonomies, so-called plus standard. And the third is a country like Vietnam, who hasn't announced exactly what it's coming up with yet, but we know of the taxonomy design. We know it will be compatible with the technical screening criteria approach of our regional taxonomy. And the third is, of course, Indonesia, who's come up with its taxonomy. It uses a traffic light system, which is compatible with the ASEAN taxonomy. So you can see none of our national taxonomies are actually incompatible with the regional taxonomy. In fact, it's interoperable. And again, our member states can use the regional taxonomy to be interoperable with global taxonomies.
Thank you, Eugene. I think that's a very important point, because what we are trying not to create further fragmentation, but to the opposite, create a kind of a level playing field and interoperability, as you mentioned. Now, I would have a question for my colleagues again from the OECD, Elia and Valentina. So, on a very important issue, one core issue is the lack of consensus on transition pre- and post-certification standards. So what is the OECD doing to help? And how is your work feeding into the transition plan task force in the UK? I don't know, whom of the two of you would like to answer this question?
I can take that one if you like. So I'll try to answer this quickly so we have more time for other questions. We did very wide consultations as we were developing the guidance. So we worked very closely with the Transition Plan Task Force. And you maybe saw on the agenda today, we had the head of green finance of the UK Treasury joining us. Unfortunately, she is not able to join in the end due to COVID. But we have been working with them extremely closely and have been feeding into the development of their framework. They've been giving us feedback on our framework. I would say on many things, our guidance and the TPT framework are very aligned. I have to add that the TPT framework is a disclosure framework, so it's very detailed on disclosures. Like also the EFRAG standards are, our guidance is not a disclosure standard. It's a high-level guidance on what should be included in a transition plan. So the purpose is a bit different, but on substance and content, I think we're very much aligned. So to answer also the first part of the question, what we are doing is to try and drive international convergence by having these consultations and very regular dialogue with other actors that are active in the space in order to try and get as close to each other as possible. Of course, there will always be differences, which will be necessary because jurisdictions have different priorities, regions have different priorities. But the type of work that Eugene is doing with ASEAN and what we're trying to do with other jurisdictions that are active in the space, I think is a good step towards reaching a point where things are at least comparable and interoperable, even if there are still differences.
Thank you.
Perhaps just to add, oh, sorry.
Sorry. Yes, please.
Just to add on the question on certification. So for what concerns transition plans in the guidance, we mentioned that obviously certification, third-party certification is important. We know that not all companies can obviously afford this. And this is especially a challenge for small and medium-sized enterprises or companies in emerging markets and developing economies. Certification helps, it gives that additional layer of assurance and builds further trust across between parties. But there's also not agreed sort of standards on what a credible certification looks like. So in the key elements, we also highlighted how, for instance, on scope 3 emissions or the use of offsets, there needs to be greater transparency also as part of certification schemes.
Thank you. Thank you, Valentina. We are reaching the end of our meeting. So before we close, I would like to give back the floor to Jo Tyndall, maybe for her to highlight 2 or 3 points she might have learned or find particularly important in the discussion we had today. Jo?
Look, thank you, Mathilde, and thank you to everyone who's contributed to this discussion today. It has been incredibly rich, and I have learned a lot. I guess my reflections are first that we clearly have a very long way to go and not a great deal of time to get there. So some sobering statistics around, first of all, that need, which we know from the IPCC, for global emissions to peak by 2025, which is only 2 years away. Hardly any time, and also the very low percentage of companies that currently have transition plans. On the positive side, it's great to hear from the speakers today that we are indeed on the pathway, that the work is beginning, and of course it's going to be important to get as much alignment as possible, as much clarity as possible, and to do that as quickly as possible. So again, good to hear how within ASEAN, for example, there is interoperability that is being built in. Now, I think it's quite clear in listening to the challenges that the private sector is facing, that it's governments that are in pretty much the same boat, and they're grappling with a lot of the same challenges. So I think we really have to be thinking about a kind of symbiotic or virtuous circle relationship between government, whether it's policymakers or regulators, and the private sector, as they look to reinforce the signals that get sent from one to the other and then back again. I think diversity is really important, and it was good to hear Valentina make a specific mention of small and medium-sized enterprises. That this is not just about MNEs, and that the approaches to transition are going to have to cater to a vast array of capabilities and resourcing. For SMEs, it's got to be kept as simple as possible. I really thought the points Eugene made about the balancing acts that need to be, kind of weighed up. Balancing ambition with realism to make sure that progress is actually made, that people start down the pathway. Balancing a just transition against backloading. Just basically using a just transition as not transitioning until it's almost too late to do so. Finally, two last points. I can't overemphasize my strong support for the need for transparency. It's critical as a base in order to be able to develop plans to make them realistic, to implement them, and then to monitor progress along the way. And that applies, again, both to governments and to the companies that are putting transition plans in place. And also, I really appreciated the reference to other environmental issues, the need to ensure that transition planning that takes into account climate change also factors in other environmental questions like biodiversity. So I really hope that the OECD guidance that has been prepared so far helps regulators and operators within those hard-to-abate sectors to quickly develop best practices as they work out how to transition to net zero. Thanks very much to everyone for their really important contributions. And I see we've got so many questions on the chat, but Q&A, but no time to answer them. So it's clearly been a great discussion.
Thank you, Jo, for this fantastic conclusion. We have very clear messages and very good impetus to continue our work on that. As Elia mentioned, we will dive deeper into mechanisms and safeguards to prevent emission-intensive locking in our work in the coming months. So I would like to thank all the participants, the speakers, the discussants for sharing your insights and highlighting the key priorities for action, both on the governance side and the company side, and the regulators also. To find more on our report, our guidance, and more generally on our work on green finance and investment, please visit our dedicated website that is linked in the chat. And we will also try to address the questions that we didn't have the time to answer. So you will have also an email address in the chat of Elia, and we'll do our best to answer your questions. And last point, you will receive an email with a link to the webinar replay, and also with a link to the slides that were used to present the guidance. And last but not least, we are organizing a workshop on metrics for climate transition and net zero greenhouse gas emissions in finance next week. Next week on the 22nd of February at 12:30 European time, Central European time, in hybrid format. So please stay tuned. We have more interesting seminars, and our Green Talk series will continue. Thank you to all of the speakers and to all of the audience for the good questions. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.